It was Christmas Eve, and everything was supposed to be perfect. The snow outside was coming down in thick, quiet flakes, covering the streets in that soft, serene blanket that always made Chicago feel like a different world. Inside our apartment, the tree sparkled with lights, the smell of cookies filled the air, and the sound of holiday music played softly in the background. I had wrapped all the presents, made sure everything was just right, and prepared for a family celebration. But nothing felt truly festive until everyone was together. I was in the kitchen, pulling a tray of cookies out of the oven when I noticed it. Noah wasn't around. My 8-year-old son had been so excited about Christmas all day, but now, when I looked around, I couldn't see him. I brushed my hands off on a towel and walked through the living room, where a group of Janet's friends were laughing loudly, glasses of wine in hand. They were talking about something trivial, their voices rising and falling like they were in the middle of a sitcom. I wasn't sure if they even noticed Noah walking out, but then I spotted him standing outside on the porch. My heart dropped into my stomach. He was on the steps, his small figure barely visible against the snow, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to make himself smaller. His bright red scarf was wrapped around his neck, but his coat wasn't zipped, and I could see how cold he was, even from where I stood. His little shoes were not enough to protect him from the frigid air, and his hands were tucked under his thighs, trying to warm them. It only took a second for me to realize that my son had been left outside, alone in the cold. "Mom?" His voice was quiet, tight, like he was trying not to cry. I rushed out the door without thinking. My socks slipped on the icy steps as I scooped him up, my arms wrapping around him like I could keep him safe from the world. He was shivering, his cheeks flushed from the cold. I could feel how tiny he was in my arms, and I felt something stir deep inside me, a protective instinct that kicked in every time I saw him hurt. "What are you doing out here, baby?" I whispered, pressing my cheek against his icy face. "They said it was for adults," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. I didn't shout. I didn't yell. I didn't want to make him feel worse, but the injustice of it hit me like a wave. Inside, I could hear the laughter continuing, people talking like nothing was wrong, like it was just another holiday. They hadn't even noticed that Noah had been left out there. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," I said, carrying him back inside, my feet crunching on the snowy ground as I walked. When we entered the living room, Janet, my mother-in-law, was still smiling, still holding her glass of wine like nothing had happened. The room was filled with her friends, and the atmosphere was loud and carefree. They were all too wrapped up in their own little world to notice the cold, the neglect, or the hurt I could see in my son's eyes. "See, he's fine," Janet said to one of her cousins, smiling as if the situation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. But Noah wasn't fine. He was still trembling in my arms, his eyes wide and unsure, looking at the people in the room as if he were trying to figure out where he fit in. I adjusted his coat, tucking his hands into the sleeves. I kissed his forehead and whispered, "Sweetheart, are you okay?" He nodded, but I could see how small he looked in that moment. He glanced at the adults in the room, his face an unreadable mask. Janet barely acknowledged him as she took another sip of wine. "It's just that you're too young for the grown-up conversations, Noah. Go play, sweetie," she said, dismissing him with a wave, as if he were a mere inconvenience. It stung. I could see the way Noah's shoulders slumped, his smile faltering as he turned away from her. I felt my heart break for him. My son had tried, like always, to be a part of everything, to be seen, to be valued. And here, once again, he was being pushed aside like an afterthought. Earlier that year, during his birthday party, it had been the same thing. He had made Janet a card, decorated with his favorite dinosaurs, his little hands trembling with excitement. "Grandma, I made this for you," he had said, running up to her, his face glowing with pride. But Janet had barely looked at it, barely acknowledged it before turning her attention elsewhere. "Go play, Noah," she had told him, as if his effort meant nothing. I had watched him walk away, his shoulders drooping with the weight of rejection, and something inside me snapped. I couldn't let that happen again. I walked over to Noah, knelt beside him, and smiled. "You did an amazing job," I said, my voice steady. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He smiled up at me, his confidence returning a little, and I held on to that moment. But now, at Christmas, it was clear that things had to change. I wasn't going to let Janet treat him like he didn't matter. I wasn't going to let my son feel small and invisible in his own home. As I adjusted his coat and tucked him in next to me on the couch, I felt a surge of determination. I wasn't going to let anyone push him aside anymore. The adults might have their traditions, their way of doing things, but this was our family, and we deserved to be seen, to be heard, and to be respected. It was time for me to set the boundaries that should have been set long ago. The night carried on with a strange, suffocating silence. After I tucked Noah into the couch beside me, I could still hear the voices from the living room, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter that felt like it was coming from a world I no longer wanted to be a part of. Janet's voice rose above the others, casual and light, as if nothing had happened. I couldn't even look at her. How could she not see what she'd done? How could she just dismiss Noah so effortlessly? I could feel the warmth from the fire in the corner, but there was something bitter in the air, something that had settled in my chest and wouldn't let go. Mark had been in the kitchen, setting the table for the next round of food, and when he came back in, I could see the look on his face, the one that always said he knew something was wrong but wasn't sure how to fix it. He caught my eyes and smiled weakly, as if he was trying to pretend everything was fine too. I didn't smile back. Instead, I turned my attention back to Noah, who was now drawing quietly, his head down, focused on the page in front of him. After a few moments, Mark sat down beside me. "He's fine," he said, as though that would somehow make it all better. His voice was soft, careful, but there was something in it that I couldn't ignore. It was the same tone he always used when he was trying to smooth things over, to make everything seem less complicated. It was the tone that made it easy for him to pretend there weren't cracks in our relationship, that his family's behavior didn't affect us. But it did. It affected Noah, and it affected me. I wasn't going to pretend anymore. I looked at Mark, my eyes hard and unyielding. "He wasn't fine, Mark," I said, my voice low but steady. "He was out there in the cold, alone, because your mother decided that he didn't belong inside with us." Mark sighed, rubbing his forehead. I know, but it's just how she is. She doesn't mean it that way." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It's not just how she is, it's how she treats him, how she treats us." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. She treats him like he doesn't matter, like he's not important enough to be a part of the conversation. "He's 8, Mark. He's my son." I could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air between us. Mark didn't say anything for a long time. He looked at Noah, who was still hunched over his drawing, and I could see the guilt flicker across his face. But he didn't speak up. He didn't defend me or Noah or our family. He just stayed silent, like he always did when Janet's behavior came up, and that silence was louder than anything. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "I can't keep letting this go on, Mark. Not for Noah. Not for me." I walked to the hallway, my mind already racing with what I needed to do. I reached for my phone, unlocking it quickly. I knew what needed to be done, even though I hated that it had to come to this. "No," I said quietly, but with determination as I began typing the message. "Janet, don't come by unannounced again. We're changing the lock codes." I hit send before I could stop myself. The words felt like they had weight, like I was closing a door that had been left wide open for too long. It was final. It was necessary. I walked back into the living room, where Noah looked up at me with those wide eyes that always seemed to see straight through me. I kneeled beside him, my hand gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "Sweetheart," I said softly, "you don't ever have to feel like you're not wanted again. Not in this house. Not ever." Noah smiled at me, and for a moment, it felt like everything was okay again, like we had found our place. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Mark came over to me then, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I replied, looking him in the eye. "We can't keep pretending this is normal, Mark. This isn't normal. You saw how she treated Noah tonight. We can't let that happen again. Not to him." I could see the conflict on Mark's face, but he didn't argue. For the first time in a long while, he didn't defend his mother. He didn't try to minimize what had happened. Instead, he just stood there, silently, as if he were finally seeing the situation through my eyes. We sat together for the rest of the evening, the laughter from the living room fading into the background. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were on the same page. When the night finally came to an end, I didn't feel the same sense of dread I had earlier. I knew we had a long road ahead of us with Janet, but I also knew I'd fight for my family. I'd fight for Noah, and I wouldn't back down. The next day, I went to the hardware store and bought a rekey kit. Mark wasn't thrilled, but he didn't stop me. I was doing what needed to be done. Janet would no longer have access to our home, not without respect. The old codes were wiped, and I set a new one, a simple one she would never guess. For the first time, I felt a sense of calm, a feeling that I had taken control, not just of the locks, but of the boundaries we needed to create. I wasn't letting anyone walk over my family anymore, not even Janet. The following week, I had to resist the temptation to check the doorbell camera every time I heard a knock or saw a shadow on the porch. I knew it was only a matter of time before Janet would come by, trying to get back in, trying to undo what I had done. I had made a decision, and now I had to stick to it, no matter how uncomfortable it made everyone else. That Friday, the doorbell rang. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at Mark, who was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone. He didn't look up, but I could tell he was aware of the tension hanging between us. The last few days had been a quiet, kind of uncomfortable. Small moments of silence that stretched into longer ones. Mark hadn't said much about the changes I'd made, and I didn't bring it up either. It felt like the elephant in the room. I walked toward the door, my fingers brushing the edge of the screen door before I stopped myself. I checked the camera. There she was. Janet, standing on the porch, hands on her hips, looking like she had every right to be there. She looked as if nothing had changed, like she was still in control. But I wasn't going to let that happen again. The doorbell chimed again. I could see her looking up at the camera, her eyes narrowing as she probably realized the lock wasn't going to buzz open like it used to. She wasn't going to be able to slip in through the back door, uninvited and unannounced. Not anymore. I stood still for a moment, watching her. Part of me felt sorry for her. She had always been the one who commanded attention, the one who set the rules, the one who pushed boundaries without ever considering anyone else's. Now that was over. My thumb hovered over the phone screen as I debated whether I should answer or just ignore her. Finally, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let her walk all over us anymore. Not after everything. I didn't owe her an explanation. But I also didn't want to get into a shouting match. I had been through enough of those with her. I opened the door just enough to speak through the crack. "Hi, Janet," I said, keeping my voice steady. I could feel my pulse quicken. "Can I help you with something?" Janet's face twisted with surprise, and I could see her hesitation. "Aaron," she said in that way she always did, as though my name was a gentle reminder of her authority. "I brought leftovers and a little gift for Noah. You're gonna let me in, right?" Her smile was forced, too wide, like she was trying to convince herself more than anyone else. I didn't move. I didn't open the door any further. "You can leave them on the porch," I said, my voice flat. "But you can't just come in, not without permission." Janet's smile faltered, her eyes flicking over my shoulder as if she were waiting for Mark to show up, to somehow make it all right. But Mark didn't come to the door. He stayed inside, his back turned to me, his phone still in his hand. I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to handle it, or if he was just hoping this would blow over, but I wasn't going to wait for him anymore. I was done. "Don't be ridiculous, Aaron," Janet snapped, her voice rising slightly. "I'm your mother. I have every right to be here. This is still my son's house, isn't it?" I could feel the old patterns emerging, the ones I had grown so used to over the years. Janet trying to turn the tables, trying to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. But I didn't flinch. I stood my ground. "No, it's our house," I said. "And you're not welcome to just walk in whenever you feel like it. I'm asking you to respect our space, Janet. If you want to see Noah, you need to ask first. And if you can't respect that, then I'll make sure it stays that way." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her. Embarrassment, maybe? Or fear. The same fear she used to make me feel every time she tried to dominate a situation. It wasn't there long, though. Her expression quickly shifted back to that familiar, calculating look she often wore. "I'll just leave the gift here, then," she said, her voice cool, as though she were dismissing me. She set the bag down on the doorstep and stepped back. "You've made your point." I didn't say anything else. I didn't apologize or try to smooth it over. I just watched her walk away, the sound of her heels clicking sharply on the concrete. I closed the door, my hands shaking slightly, but not from fear, from relief. I had set the boundaries, and I had followed through with them. Janet had tried to make me second-guess myself, but I wasn't going to let her do that anymore. She needed to understand that we wouldn't be bullied. Not by her, not by anyone. Mark came into the room a few minutes later, holding his coffee. He looked at the gift bag on the floor and then at me, his brow furrowed. "You didn't let her in?" I shook my head, looking at Noah, who was watching the whole thing unfold with wide eyes. I smiled at him and gave him a quick hug. "No, buddy, I didn't. But you don't have to worry about that anymore." Mark didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could tell he was processing everything. Finally, he nodded, though it was slow, as if the weight of it was settling in. "I get it," he said, his voice softer now. "I get it." That night, as we settled in for bed, I felt a quiet pride in myself. I had done what I had to do. I'd protected my family, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from us. I didn't need Janet's approval. I didn't need anyone else's approval. We were finally making our own rules, and that was all that mattered. The next few days passed with a strange sense of quiet. Janet didn't call. She didn't show up at our door again, and the silence between Mark and me was more palpable than I liked. He hadn't said much about the lock change or the decision I'd made. He was still trying to reconcile everything, still processing the shift in our family dynamic. But the tension was there, beneath the surface, and I knew it was just a matter of time before things boiled over. That Saturday, I was cleaning the kitchen after breakfast when my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen. It was a message from Janet. No greeting, no attempt to be polite, just a simple line, "I'm coming by to pick up Noah for lunch." I stood frozen for a moment. The words seemed to echo in my mind, reminding me of all the reasons I had put my foot down. I wasn't going to let her walk all over us anymore. I wasn't going to let her pull me into her manipulative games, making decisions for us like we didn't have a say in our own lives. Mark was in the living room, flipping through a magazine. I hesitated before I walked over to him. "Janet just texted," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Mark raised an eyebrow, glancing at my phone. "She's picking up Noah for lunch?" I nodded, my hands tense as I gripped the phone. "No, she's not. Not unless she respects our rules." Mark looked at me for a moment, his lips pressed together in a thin line. I could see the conflict brewing in his eyes. He didn't want to upset his mother, but I could tell he was starting to understand what I had been saying. He had seen the way she treated Noah, how dismissive she was of him, of me. He had witnessed enough. "Okay," he said slowly, his voice quieter than usual. "I'll talk to her." I shook my head, a little frustrated. "Mark, we've been over this. You don't need to talk to her. She knows what she did. She knows the boundaries now. I'm not having a conversation about it." Not anymore. Mark exhaled, setting the magazine down on the coffee table. He ran his hand through his hair, looking a little lost. I could see he was torn. He was always caught in the middle, trying to balance between his mother and his family. "I just don't want this to blow up, you know?" he said, his voice more tired than anything. "I don't want to cause a scene." "There's already a scene, Mark," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. The scene was when she pushed Noah aside and left him out in the cold on Christmas Eve. That's the scene. I'm not backing down from this. I'm protecting him. Mark didn't argue after that. Instead, he just nodded and walked into the kitchen. He grabbed his phone off the counter and began typing a response to Janet. I stood back, watching him for a moment. It was the first time in a long while that he was taking a stand without hesitation. When he was done, he handed me the phone. The message was short and simple. "Noah's not available today. We're sticking to the rules we discussed. Please respect them." I felt a small pang of relief. Mark was finally showing up for us in the way he should have all along. He was finally seeing that it wasn't just about appeasing his mother, It was about protecting our family, our space, and our well-being. When Janet replied, it was to be expected. The message was filled with that same defensive tone, the same passive-aggressive comments about how she was just trying to be involved, just trying to help. She even used the old, tired line about how she was family and shouldn't have to ask for permission. I didn't even bother responding to her. I knew this battle wasn't going to be won with words. It was going to be won with actions. The day passed uneventfully, and by the time evening came, the weight of the situation had started to feel lighter. It wasn't about winning. It was about setting the boundaries that needed to be set and standing by them. Janet had tested us, and we had passed. There was still a lot to figure out with Mark, but for now, I knew I had done what I needed to do for Noah and for our family. Later that night, as I tucked Noah into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. He didn't say much, but there was a softness in his gaze, a quiet understanding that seemed to say, "I'm safe here." And that was enough. Noah had learned something important over the past few weeks, something I hadn't realized he needed to learn until now. He was important. His voice mattered. His presence wasn't something to be ignored or pushed aside. And as his mother, I was there to make sure he knew that. Mark came into the room after Noah was asleep, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat down beside me on the couch, the space between us finally feeling less strained. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, rubbing the back of his neck like he wasn't sure what to do next. "I know this is hard, but I see what you're doing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see why you're doing it." I smiled at him, my heart heavy but light at the same time. "I'm doing it for us, Mark, for Noah. We've been putting up with this for too long. It's time for things to change." He nodded, his face softening. "Yeah, it is." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. We were in it together, for better or for worse, and maybe that was the change I had been waiting for all along. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. Janet didn't try to push her way back in, and that left me with a strange mix of relief and unease. I kept wondering if she would give up, if she'd accept the boundaries we had set, or if she would find another way to worm her way back into our lives, disregarding everything I had fought for. Mark seemed to be holding his breath, waiting for the next explosion, but he was also walking alongside me. I'm no longer dismissing my actions as overreactions. Noah seemed to adjust to the changes without much complaint, but I noticed little things. He no longer hesitated when he came into the living room. He didn't sit at the back of the room, shrinking into the corner like he once had. He took his place with us, and when Janet had called the following Sunday to ask if he could come over, it was the first time I heard him speak up for himself, his voice small but steady. "I don't want to go to Grandma's today," he had said, his fingers fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "I want to stay here." The relief I felt in that moment was overwhelming. It was one thing for me to stand up for Noah, but it meant everything to me that he could now stand up for himself. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. My heart swelled with pride as I looked at him, this little boy who had once been invisible in his own family, now finding his voice. But then, just when I thought things were starting to settle down, I received a text from Mark on a Wednesday morning. It was simple, almost casual. "Janet wants to meet for coffee, just the two of us." I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. My first instinct was to say no, to shut it down right then and there. I didn't want to make peace with someone who had treated my family like a revolving door, someone who thought she could walk in and out of our lives at will. But then I thought about it more, and something in me shifted. Maybe this was the moment where I could truly put the past behind us, where we could move forward without carrying the weight of the old wounds. I sent Mark a quick reply, "Only if she respects our boundaries." I wasn't sure how this would go, but I knew I wasn't going to walk into any trap. If she wanted to talk, it would be on our terms. The coffee date was set for Saturday afternoon at a small cafe near the park. I knew it was a neutral spot, somewhere she couldn't try to control the environment. I could almost hear Janet's voice in my head as I sat there at the cafe, waiting. I knew she was probably rehearsing her lines, trying to figure out how to make everything seem like it wasn't really her fault. But I wasn't going to let her off the hook this time. When she walked in, she looked as polished as ever, her hair perfectly styled, a bright smile pasted on her face like she was walking into a room full of old friends. But I saw through it. I saw the tension in her eyes, the way she fidgeted with her purse as she sat down across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I watched her, waiting for her to make the first move. Finally, she broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she said, her voice almost too calm, like she was measuring every word, and I realized I might have overstepped. "I don't want to cause any more tension between us. I just want what's best for Noah." I wanted to laugh. She sounded so rehearsed, so much like she was reading from a script, but I kept my expression neutral. "It's not just about Noah, Janet," I said, my voice steady. "It's about respect. Respect for our family, for our space. If you want to be involved, then you have to respect the boundaries we've set. You don't get to decide when to show up and when to step back. We're not doing this on your terms anymore." Her smile faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "I understand," she said, nodding. I never wanted to make you feel like I was taking over." "You did," I said bluntly. "You made Noah feel like he wasn't part of the family. You made me feel like I was always walking on eggshells, never knowing where I stood with you. And that stops now. If you want to be in our lives, you need to show up in the right way. No more trying to control everything." For a long moment, Janet didn't respond. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization setting in that this wasn't going to be a quick fix. She wasn't going to get away with her old tricks anymore. Finally, she sighed, a long, drawn-out sound. "I've been hard on you, haven't I?" she asked, her voice softening. I didn't realize how much I was pushing. I just wanted to be close to Noah. I miss him. And I guess I thought I could just take control. I looked her in the eyes. It's not about control, it's about understanding, about respecting what we need. I'm not saying you can't be a part of Noah's life, but you need to earn it. You need to prove that you can be respectful, that you can listen. Janet looked down at her coffee, the silence stretching between us. After a while, she finally nodded. "I can do that," she said quietly. "I'll try. I know I've made mistakes." It wasn't a perfect apology, and it certainly wasn't enough to erase everything that had happened. But it was a start. It was the first step toward something new, something better. As we finished our coffee, I felt a sense of relief. Janet wasn't going to be the same person in our lives anymore. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a new way to be a family. When we left the cafe, I felt lighter, like the burden of the past was starting to lift. It wasn't over, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And that was all I needed for now. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, cautious dance. Janet kept her distance, but there was a subtle shift in the air when she did reach out. It wasn't like before, when her texts were demanding or filled with an underlying sense of entitlement. Now there was a carefulness in her tone, a hesitance that hadn't been there before. She still tried to insert herself into our lives, but there was something different about it. She was no longer assuming she could take control. She was asking, waiting for permission. It was a step forward, but I could tell she was still testing the waters, still figuring out how to navigate the new boundaries. Noah seemed to notice it too. There were moments when he would glance up at me, unsure if it was okay to answer her calls or accept the gifts she sent. But I could see that little by little, he was learning to trust that things were different now. He had seen his grandmother's behavior for what it was, and he knew I wasn't going to let her treat him the way she used to. Mark, on the other hand, was still walking a fine line. He wasn't quite as vocal as I had hoped he would be, but I could tell he was adjusting to the changes. He was still caught in the middle, wanting to keep the peace between his mother and me, but I saw him more aware of the way Janet had made him feel in the past. He wasn't quite as quick to make excuses for her anymore. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One Sunday afternoon, Mark suggested we all go to the park, just the three of us. It had been a while since we'd spent time together as a family, without the pressures of everything else hanging over us. I liked the idea of it, so we bundled up Noah, grabbed the coats, and headed out. As we walked through the park, Noah running ahead, laughing and kicking up the snow, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just the fresh air or the quiet beauty of the winter landscape. It was the feeling of being free, of having a sense of control over our own lives again. I was no longer second-guessing myself, no longer feeling like I had to navigate the landmines of Janet's behavior. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing things for the right reasons. We spent a few hours at the park, walking around the frozen pond, letting Noah skate across the ice with his little boots. Mark and I watched him, and for once, there was no tension, no undercurrent of frustration. It felt easy. And when we got home, we made dinner together, laughing at Noah's latest antics and talking about the future like it was something we could shape on our own terms. It was the next day, though, when the tension started creeping back in. Mark came home from work late, his expression tight and guarded. I could tell something was off, but I didn't press him right away. Instead, I set dinner on the table and let him sit down, hoping he would talk when he was ready. "I talked to my mom today," he said after a few minutes of silence, his fork halfway to his mouth but not moving. "She's upset that we're keeping her at arm's length. She doesn't understand why I can't just fix things, why I can't just make everything go back to the way it was." I set my fork down, focusing on him. "Mark, we talked about this. We can't just go back to the way things were. She hurt us. She hurt Noah, and it's going to take more than a couple of coffee dates to fix that." I know," he said, his voice soft but strained. "But she's my mom, Aaron. I don't know how to handle her when she's upset like this. I don't know how to make her understand that things are different now." I could feel the old frustration rising in my chest. "You can't make her understand, Mark. You can't change her, no matter how much you try. But you can protect your family. You can stand with me and Noah. That's what matters." "I am," he said quickly, his eyes flicking to mine. "I just don't want to lose her. I don't want to lose what's left of my family." The words hit me harder than I expected. "And what about us, Mark? What about Noah and me? What are we if you keep letting her walk all over us?" He didn't answer right away, and I could see the guilt on his face, the way he was torn between his mother and the family he had with me. But after a long pause, he put his fork down and met my gaze. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't been as supportive as I should have been. I've been trying to make peace without realizing that peace comes at a price. I see now that I've been letting you carry all the weight, and I'm sorry for that. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose Noah. I'm with you, no matter what." I felt a rush of relief, a weight lifting from my chest. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the end of the story, but in that moment, I knew we were on the same page. We were both willing to fight for this family, for what we had built together, and that was enough. Later that night, after Noah had gone to bed, I sat down next to Mark on the couch, feeling the quiet of the house settle around us. There were still battles to fight, still things to work through, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could handle it together. We weren't fighting against each other anymore. We were fighting for the future we wanted, and that made all the difference. "You're right," Mark said softly, his hand brushing against mine. "We're going to get through this together." And for the first time in a while, I truly believed it. Life is full of unexpected challenges, but the key is setting boundaries and standing firm in what you believe is right, whether it's protecting your family or just taking control of your space. Remember, you can't change others, but you can control how you respond. So take charge, trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to speak up. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to the Revenge Protocol YouTube channel? We'll help you navigate those tricky family dynamics with a little humor and a lot of sass. Drop a comment, and let's keep this conversation going.